Blanche Taylor Moore was accused of fatally poisoning her first husband, also accused of poisoning her second husband. The jury found her guilty and Moore was sentenced to death.
Blanche, how you feeling?
No comment, stay away.
How are you feeling?
It's hard to believe that any one person would do such a horrible thing, but yet it all seems to point that way.
It is early morning on North Carolina's death row. The hallway is quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than sound. A guard walks slowly past the metal doors, checking each one, his footsteps echoing like a slow clock. Far down that hallway, behind a steel door with peeling paint, sits a woman the state once promised to execute more than 30 years ago. Her name is Blanche Taylor Moore. Most inmates here are young or middle-aged. Blanche is not. She is old now, her hair thin, her skin marked by time. When she speaks, her voice has the soft tone of a church grandmother. If you passed her on the street, you would never imagine that prosecutors once called her one of the most dangerous women in North Carolina's history. She has lived in this place longer than some guards have been alive. Long enough to watch prisoners come and go. Long enough for her death sentence to fade into something strange, a threat that never arrives. Some mornings like this one, she sits on her small bunk and stares at the faint sunlight slipping through the narrow window. She has outlived the doctors who treated her victims, outlived the detectives who built the case, outlived almost everyone who once sat in the courtroom to hear her fate. But the question remains, how did a smiling grandmother, a woman who prayed, cooked, and hugged the people she loved, become the center of one of the most disturbing poisoning cases the South has ever seen? How did she end up here, in a cold cell, with a death sentence waiting like a chapter the state never bothered to finish? To understand that, we have to go back. Long before the headlines, long before the funerals, before anyone suspected a thing. Back to the life of a woman who wore kindness on her face, while something far darker lived quietly in her shadow. Blanche Taylor Moore was born in 1933 in a small, dusty town in North Carolina. The house she grew up in was modest, the kind where the walls seemed to hold every argument, every disappointment. Her father was strict, a man who believed discipline was the only way to teach respect. Her mother was quiet, worn down by years of keeping the household running. Blanche learned early that attention came in small doses, a nod, a smile, a rare word of praise, and that life often demanded obedience before affection. As a child, Blanche was clever, observant, always watching how people reacted, how they moved, how they showed weakness. She excelled in school, not because she loved learning, but because she wanted the control that knowledge could give her. Friends remember her as polite, soft-spoken, someone who could make you feel special in one moment and dismissed in the next. It was a subtle power she held without anyone noticing. By the time she was a young woman, Blanche had entered the world of work, taking jobs in local stores, and eventually in church kitchens. She had a charm that opened doors, a smile that could ease tension, a voice that could soothe a worried customer or a demanding boss. Men noticed her, women liked her, but there was something quiet and unsettling beneath the surface. Something even she did not fully understand. She married young, not once but multiple times, each relationship a mix of devotion and tension. On the outside, Blanche appeared devoted, caring, even selfless. But the cracks in her personality, the impatience with illness, the quiet calculation in her words, started to show in small ways. A spouse would complain of strange food tastes. An argument would end with a suspicious illness. At the time, No one suspected what these patterns would one day reveal. The life she built seemed ordinary, even wholesome. Yet underneath, in the shadows of charm and politeness, a darker thread was weaving, one that would eventually stretch across decades and lives. By the late 1970s, Blanche Taylor Moore's life was a careful balancing act. On the surface, she seemed settled. A woman known in her community for her cooking, her church attendance, her polite manners. But beneath that calm exterior, tension was building. Money was tight, and her relationships were complicated. Love had become a negotiation, a series of unspoken rules. Blanche had learned early that attention and control could protect her, and now she relied on them more than ever. It started quietly. Friends and family noticed small changes, subtle patterns that no one questioned at the time. A husband would grow sick after a meal, only to recover later. Another partner complained of strange symptoms that never had a clear cause. Doctors shrugged. Blanche smiled, sat beside them in the hospital, poured the tea, baked the desserts, always calm, always composed. She made it look like care, devotion, even love. But there was a rhythm to the chaos. Illness followed tension, fear followed conflict. And Blanche, ever observant, seemed to learn which buttons to press to keep control, to bend the world to her will without anyone noticing. The calm mask she wore hid the growing darkness inside. A flicker of irritation, a hint of impatience, became a method. And the method became habit. By the mid-1980s, the pattern could no longer be ignored. Men close to her fell sick under mysterious circumstances. The community whispered, but no one wanted to accuse a woman who prayed at church and baked for the neighbors. Blanche moved carefully, her exterior never cracking, even as the consequences of her actions began to mount. What started as small, almost imperceptible moments of control had evolved into something more deliberate. Something that would not be stopped by concern or suspicion. The line between care and harm had blurred, and no one saw it. Not yet. The first shadow fell in the early 1970s, with Blanche Taylor Moore's first husband. He grew ill suddenly, complaining of fatigue and stomach pain. Doctors could not find a clear cause. Blanche was there at his bedside every day, bringing him food she had prepared herself, offering comforting words, guiding the nurses when necessary. His death came quietly, leaving friends and family with questions they never dared voice. At the time, it seemed like misfortune, a tragic loss that no one could explain. Soon after, Blanche's father began to decline under similarly mysterious circumstances. He was a strong man once, but over months, he weakened, showing symptoms doctors described as puzzling. Blanche stayed close, caring for him with the same attention she had given her husband. The community whispered quietly, but the deaths were spread over years, and suspicion did not yet fall on her. She remained a figure of devotion, attending church, visiting neighbors, always presenting herself as the caring daughter and wife. By the 1980s, a clearer pattern was forming, though few recognized it. Blanche's charm and composure masked a disturbing rhythm. Friends and relatives noticed that men close to her often fell ill suddenly. It was during this time that Raymond Reed entered her life. Reed was a man in his 50s, married to Blanche's neighbor. They became friends, and soon he was dependent on her attention, often visiting her home for meals and conversation. Then the sickness began. It started subtly. Nausea, fatigue, occasional vomiting. Doctors were baffled, writing it off as stress or infection. Blanche was always present, checking his medications, offering homemade remedies, and bringing her signature banana pudding or sweetened iced tea. Each visit coincided with a worsening of his condition. Families grew alarmed, but the pieces did not yet fit. No one questioned the woman who seemed so devoted. To outsiders, she was a caretaker. To those falling ill, she was the last person they saw clearly before their bodies betrayed them. Raymond's condition deteriorated over months. He was hospitalized several times, each stay ending in temporary recovery, then another relapse. Blanche never left his side. Nurses remembered her calm presence, her insistence on bringing food from home, her constant attention. But medical records began to show anomalies. Tests returned strange results, organs failing in ways doctors could not explain. Finally, in 1986, Raymond collapsed for the last time. His death was sudden, but explained at first as natural causes. Only later would toxicology reveal the silent hand behind it: arsenic. The trail was chilling not because of violence or shouting, but because of quiet, calculated steps. Each illness had the same signature: subtle, slow, undetectable at first, administered with care. Food and drink were the instruments. Attention was the cover. Blanche Taylor Moore had woven a pattern of suffering into the ordinary moments of life. And at the time, no one suspected that the woman sitting so calmly at each bedside was the cause of so much pain. Even as doctors puzzled, families mourned, and communities whispered, Blanche maintained the mask of the devoted wife, daughter, and friend. Each death became another note in a melody that only she could conduct, a trail of quiet, untraceable harm that would eventually unravel under the scrutiny of the law. By the late 1980s, Blanche Taylor Moore's quiet pattern of illness and death had attracted the attention of one persistent detective. He had noticed the strange coincidences, men close to her falling ill under baffling circumstances. At first, there was nothing concrete. Deaths were written off as natural, accidents, or misfortune. But the detective saw the thread linking them together and refused to let it go. He began compiling records, interviewing relatives, and looking for any overlooked detail that might explain the growing list of sudden illnesses. The breakthrough came when he ordered a series of toxicology tests on the bodies of Blanche's previous husbands and her father. The results were impossible to ignore. Arsenic, a slow-acting poison, had been present in lethal amounts. The evidence was clear. These deaths were not accidents. They were deliberate, and all roads led back to Blanche. Authorities quickly realized the scope of what they were facing. Exhumations were ordered for several bodies buried years earlier. Each body told the same story: abnormal arsenic levels, consistent with repeated exposure. It was a shocking revelation. Families were forced to revisit old grief, wondering how long they had been deceived by someone they trusted. The number of deaths aligned with Blanche's presence in each victim's life. The picture was chilling, methodical, patient, and cold. When officers came to arrest her on July 18, 1989, Blanche's reaction was calm, almost serene. She did not panic. She did not yell or resist. She answered questions politely, as if she were attending a social visit rather than facing the culmination of decades of suspicion. Some who watched her that day would later describe her demeanor as unnerving. A quiet control that never faltered, even in the face of evidence that could not be denied. The arrest marked the turning point. The law had finally caught up with a woman who had walked freely through her community, hiding behind her charm, her prayers, her desserts, and her smile. It was the moment when suspicion became certainty, when whispers turned into formal charges. Blanche Taylor Moore, The woman who had managed to evade scrutiny for so long was now a prisoner of the very system she had quietly defied. Investigators left no detail unchecked. Every hospital visit, every meal she had prepared for a sick spouse, every visit to a loved one's bedside was now evidence in a case that would capture the nation's attention. What had been invisible for years was now laid bare. A trail of calculated poisonings and a woman who, for decades, had hidden in plain sight. The trial of Blanche Taylor Moore began in 1990, drawing attention from across North Carolina. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious neighbors, and the families of victims, all waiting to see the woman who had quietly shattered so many lives. Blanche entered calmly, dressed in subdued colors, her face composed, giving little away. To many, her serenity was chilling. Prosecutors laid out their case meticulously. Medical experts described the strange illnesses, the repeated hospital visits, and the results of toxicology tests, each pointing toward arsenic poisoning. Witnesses testified about the meals Blanche had brought to sick husbands, the iced tea and desserts that had become a signature of her care. But behind the acts of service, the evidence painted a different picture. A deliberate pattern of harm. The jury watched closely as the details emerged, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Families of the victims struggled to hold back tears. Blanche, for her part, remained poised. She answered questions when prompted, spoke with a quiet confidence, and often met the prosecution's claims with measured calm. Her demeanor unsettled many, a stark contrast to the devastation unfolding around her. After weeks of testimony and closing arguments, the jury returned a guilty verdict for first-degree murder. In November 1990, she was sentenced to death. The decision shocked the community. Some believed justice had finally been served, while others struggled with the idea of executing a woman who had always appeared so gentle. Decades of appeals followed. Lawyers challenged procedural issues, argued over evidence, and fought to stay the execution. North Carolina's death penalty system, combined with legal delays and execution freezes, meant Blanche would remain alive long after her sentence was handed down. 30 years later, she remains on death row, a prisoner of the law, but untouched by the ultimate consequence. The trial cemented her infamy as the Black Widow of North Carolina, a woman whose calm exterior hid a calculated cruelty that the justice system eventually recognized, even if the sentence has yet to be carried out. Blanche Taylor Moore has been under a death sentence for more than 3 decades. Yet the execution she was once promised has never come. North Carolina's death penalty system has been on hold for years, and Blanche, now elderly, remains in the same small cell where she has lived much of her adult life. Time has softened some of the shock for the public, but it has done little for the families of her victims, who are still waiting for the closure that the law cannot provide. Each day on death row is a quiet repetition. Guards make their rounds. Meals are delivered. Legal paperwork passes through metal slots. Blanche moves with the caution and routine of someone who has spent years counting the hours, the days, the decades. Her world is small, measured, and controlled, much like it was before her crimes were revealed. Only now, the stakes are final. Imagining her execution is like imagining a scene that may never arrive. The chamber would be sterile and quiet. Witnesses would sit tensely, families hoping for justice, staff performing their duties with methodical care. Blanche would be led inside, calm as always, her expression unreadable. Words would be spoken, last meals eaten, and the process completed. But for now, that day exists only in theory. The pause stretches on. Victims' families are left to live with both grief and frustration. They have waited decades for recognition of their pain, for the certainty of justice. Meanwhile, Blanche waits too, a figure of patience and inevitability. Her punishment is both immediate and delayed. A sentence carried out in years of confinement rather than a single definitive moment. In this strange limbo, the case continues to hold a mirror up to human nature, to cruelty hidden in plain sight, to the slow work of justice, and to the ways that time can stretch both punishment and reflection across decades. Blanche's life on death row is a testament not just to her crimes, but to the long, quiet shadow they cast over everyone around her. Blanche Taylor Moore's story is a study in contrasts. On the surface, she was a grandmother, a churchgoer, a woman who baked desserts and offered comfort to those around her. But beneath that ordinary exterior lay a calculated cruelty that unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, over decades. It is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with loud words or visible anger. Sometimes it hides behind charm, patience, and the routines of everyday life. Her crimes teach a hard lesson about trust. People trusted her, husbands, fathers, friends, neighbors, because she fit the shape of what they expected care to look like. That trust, once given, became a shield behind which harm could move undetected. It shows how easily the familiar can mask danger, how ordinary gestures can conceal deliberate destruction. Blanche's case is also a story about manipulation. She understood the small ways to influence those around her, when to offer comfort, when to smile, when to remain calm. Each gesture, each act of apparent kindness, became a tool for control. Her victims never saw the pattern until it was too late. The danger was always there, quiet and precise, woven into moments that felt safe. The story raises questions about justice delayed. Decades passed between the first deaths and her arrest. Years have passed since her conviction. Families continue to wait for finality, for a reckoning that may never come. The delay does not lessen the pain. It stretches it, leaving grief and frustration to linger alongside the memory of loss. Finally, her life reminds us how evil can hide in plain sight. Blanche did not fit the stereotype of a violent criminal. She was unassuming, polite, almost ordinary. And yet, behind that exterior, she left a trail of suffering that took years to uncover. It is a warning that appearances can deceive, and that true danger can live quietly, unnoticed, until evidence finally forces recognition. In the end, the story of Blanche Taylor Moore is not only about her crimes. It is about the fragile boundaries between care and harm, the ease with which trust can be exploited, and the long, difficult work of justice in a world where evil often moves silently, waiting to be seen. It leaves the viewer unsettled, thoughtful, and aware that darkness sometimes wears a familiar face.